Most gracious God, take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Amen. So I was looking through a bunch of emails the other day, reading the subject lines to kind of see which ones needed to be dealt with right away and which ones I might want to wait till later for. And I found one that looked like a joke. It said, what happens when a priest, a bishop, and a scholar go into a bar? Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? And it was from our new diocesan director of communications, David Dreisbach. And so I thought, well, I've got a lot to do. I'll wait and read this later when I can appreciate the joke. So it wasn't until a couple of days that I actually got back to read the joke, and it turned out that the joke was on me because it wasn't a joke. He was really asking what happens when a bishop, a priest, and a scholar go into a bar. Because on November 6th, our bishop, Tom Bridenthal, one of our priests, Jane Gerdston, who directs Fresh Expressions for the diocese, new ways of getting the Word of God out into the world, and Walter Brueggemann, who is one of the world's leading biblical scholars, who just happens to also be an Episcopalian, is retired now, though he's still writing, and goes to the cathedral in Cincinnati. So the three of them are going into a bar called Molly Malone's. I think it's in, is there Pleasant Ridge? Does that sound right? I think it's Pleasant Ridge. Anyway, and they're gonna do a YouTube thing on this. But the three of them are going to go into the bar and just be there and field questions from anybody that happens to ask them questions. So David was just getting the word out with that catchy little thing of what happens when a priest, a bishop, and a biblical scholar walk into a bar. It will be interesting to see what happens. Jesus often started his stories kind of in the same way. And quite often the joke was on the people that heard them. We don't always get that because we've heard them so much, and usually we tend to hear them in places where people tell us this is what it means. Though usually Jesus wasn't telling them to get you to come up with one meaning. He was telling them to get you to start thinking about things. And so the joke is usually on the people that hear them. And in this case, the joke is on the people that hear them. He says, two men went into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and one a tax collector. And he was telling it to an audience that would have included scribes, Pharisees, people that were good religious folk like you and me. And so they would have thought, okay, this is going to be good. Two men went to the temple to pray. One is going to be a good example of what it should be to religious, and the other is this hated tax collector who is one of us, and he does all the things. I'm sure he prays, he goes to temple, he goes to synagogue, he does all the things, he observes the holidays, he observes fasts, because the tax collectors were one of them. They just also worked for the Roman government and charged exorbitant amounts for the taxes so that they could make their own living above whatever the taxes were to begin with. But they both went into the temple to pray. And so the audience would be expecting it to be a story, lifting up how to be like the Pharisee as opposed to living life like the tax collector. And then when it gets to the end, the tables are turned. The tables are turned, and it's the tax collector that Jesus lifts up. The joke was on the Pharisees. And the joke, the punchline, was that the way the Pharisee had come and approached prayer and worship said a lot about how he lived his life. And the way the tax collector came and approached worship said a lot about the way he was coming to live his life. You see, the tax collector went away changed. The Pharisee went away just sort of the same way he had come in. It wasn't about the practices. It wasn't that something was wrong with praying or fasting or tithing. Those are practices that the tax collector probably did also. It was what they did with it. The Pharisee came with a sense of obligation. This is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to pray. You're supposed to fast on the fast days. You're supposed to feast on the feast days, so they didn't go into that completely. You're supposed to tithe a tenth of your income. That's been the biblical standard for all along, a tenth of your income. He was doing all the things he was supposed to do, but that's what he did. He did what he was supposed to do, and he could check it off. I'm supposed to pray. Here I am. Check that one off. I'm supposed to fast. I did that last Friday. Check that one off. I'm supposed to tithe. Wrote my check today. Check that one off. And it could go on and on and on. It wasn't the practice that was the problem. It was the approach to it. And more than likely, the way he approached his relationship with God said a lot about the way he approached life. He probably approached life the same way, justifying himself by checking off the boxes of what he was obligated to do. The tax collector, on the other hand, approached with an openness to be changed, and a really raw honesty. A raw honesty about somehow having bumped up against the fact that the way he was making his living was wrong. And he falls on his knees because it has hit him so hard. And he simply asks God to help him and to change him, which probably was going to cause a lot of complications in his life, since he had been making his living that way for a long time and, had to go back and tell his wife, guess what? We're not going to be having as much money as we used to have because I'm not going to make my living that way anymore. He came and he fell on his knees and was honest about who he was and was open to God changing him. And what Jesus says is that says something about his approach to life too. He came into the temple just as he was, and realizing that just as he was needed some work. And he probably went through life looking to see what needed to be changed as well, or he probably would never have gotten there to make that kind of confession. On the one hand, there's an approach to life that lives life by obligation and can live a very good life that way, but never be changed. On the other hand, there's a way of living life with an openness that's willing to say, there are parts of me that need healing. There are parts of me that are broken. On the one hand, we cannot ever see that or be scared to see it and go through life blind to it. On the other hand, we can realize that to be human is to have some brokenness. And so if we think we have no brokenness, we probably just have some brokenness we haven't looked at yet. I heard a joke the other day, if you look at your family and you think that nobody in your family is crazy, you can pretty well bet you're the one. And so when we look at our life and we don't realize that we have brokenness, we can pretty well bet we're the one. And so we come to God with that openness. God can heal the brokenness once we give God a crack to do that. We just have to give the crack. But it occurred to me that just as this parable showed how the two men came to worship differently, and that reflected something on how they lived their life, I think that's true for us too. Something about the way we come to worship also reflects the way we live our lives. When I come to worship and I find my mind wandering around and I can't stay on track, I have to do that in life too. I have to pull myself back. It's a form of brokenness, because to not be present, to be someplace else, is a form of brokenness. It's not a huge evil. You don't need to be thrown in jail for it, but it is a brokenness. You have missed something, and others have missed your presence. Or if I come to worship, and basically what I'm interested in is how long is it going to take to finish so I can get on to the next thing, that says something about how I approach life sometimes too. How quickly can I get this done so that I can do this, so that I can do that really quickly so that I can do that, so that I can do this really quickly so I can do that, and on and on and on. Which eventually is a form of brokenness that will kill us physically, spiritually, emotionally, because we weren't built to move that fast. And when we come to worship, and basically what we spend our time doing is deciding what we like or don't like about it, Do I like that hymn or do I not like that hymn? Do I just hate it when the preacher says this or that? Or could he or she have said it better? I have trouble when I go off to another church. I have to remind myself not to critique the service, but to let the service speak to me. And if that's the way sometimes we fall into worship, it's the way we fall into life. We go from one thing to another, judging whether we like it or not, or whether it's interesting or not, or whether it could have been done better or not, instead of openly going into it just as I am and just as it is, and letting it speak to us. Because it takes an openness to let God change us. It takes an openness to let God speak to us. And so what would happen if in worship, if we didn't know the hymn, what would happen if we really paid attention to the words and asked how those words were speaking to us, even if we just hummed, or even if we were just reading the words? Or what would happen in the silence before confession if instead of just waiting for me to start talking so we could hurry up and say the confession and say the absolution and get on to the stuff and the peace and the kids will come back in and pretty soon we can get to coffee minute. What if in that silence we really looked back over our week and thought about the things that we had done that were not particularly helpful to other people or to ourselves? None of us have escaped them. If we think we have, we are a lot like the Pharisee who just doesn't see. We all do things during the week that are not particularly helpful to ourselves or to others. Or what if we thought in that time about the things we could have done that we didn't do? We didn't want to take the time to do it. Would have been helpful to somebody else, or would have been helpful to ourselves. Would have been good to get more than 3 hours sleep that night. What if in that silence we really thought about those things? So that then when we said the words together, we would really be offering that up to God and saying, here are the ways in the last week that brokenness has kind of come into my life. Then in the confession, we would be coming to God just as we are, as the hymn says, and we'd be asking God to heal the brokenness. And it would be the beginning of change. See, we live in a culture where we think that if something's going to touch our heart or touch us spiritually, we come and we'll sit there and it's supposed to do it to us somehow. And so we can leave a service and feel like nothing happened. Well, if nothing happened, it's because you weren't engaged. Because what happens isn't dependent on anything else here. If nothing happened in the worship service for you, it's because you didn't engage it with your heart. You didn't come to it open. And if you do it in worship, you're probably doing it in life. If you're doing it in worship, probably in life, you're coming to things without an open heart. You're talking to people perhaps and judging what they're saying rather than trying to hear what they're saying, or even to hear behind what they're saying. See, we were made for so much more. We were created for so much more than just getting through the hours of the day. We were created for so much more than just a list of obligations that we check off so at the end of the day we can say, I did a good job. We're made for real relationships. We're made for engaging ourselves and others in this world. And the only way we can do that is to come as the tax collector did. Not afraid to admit our own brokenness. And with a complete assurance that when we lift that up to God, God will heal it. I don't know what it's going to look like in that bar when our bishop and our scholar and our priest go in. I don't know whether the people there will be there more like a Pharisee wanting to catch them up on something, whether they'll come with their own agenda and their own sense of obligations and are just trying to kind of see if they can test them. I don't know. Or I don't know if there'll be some people who come just as they are because they're really looking for something, and whether they like the way Walter Brueggemann looks or not, like or not, or whether they think Bishop Breidenthal talks too soft or not, or whether they think Jane Gertzen's too short or not, that they will look past that and listen and want to ask and will come with their hearts. But I'll tell you this, those who come, either just because it's an obligation to check off, or because it's something they want to prove for themselves, won't lose anything, but they won't go away changed. But those who come and are looking and are searching and are honest about where they are, even if the only thing all three of them say is hello, something will happen.